Hello, everyone. Welcome back to today's story. In this episode, we follow James and Diep as they face one of the hardest choices of their lives. When a woman suddenly appears, claiming to be little Nee's grandmother, their peaceful farm life is shaken. Determined to uncover the truth, they spend $10,000 hiring an investigator to verify her identity. But as the search unfolds, what begins as a quest for answers becomes a test of love, trust, and sacrifice. Torn between protecting Nye and honoring her roots, Diep must decide what it truly means to be a mother. Stay with us until the end to witness this emotional journey. And don't forget to subscribe to help us reach 10,000 subscribers. Your support truly means the world to us. The dinner table is quiet tonight. The smell of grilled meat still hangs in the air, but the warmth that usually fills their meals is gone. Diep lowers her chopsticks, her thoughts elsewhere. "Someone came to see me today," she says softly, eyes distant. "She said she's Nye's grandmother." James freezes for a second, his hand hovering over the plate. "Her grandmother," he repeats, trying to process it. Diep nods. "She showed up without warning, said she's been looking for Nye for years." Her voice wavers slightly. If she really cared, why now? Why after all this time? James leans back, watching her carefully. "Did she have any proof?" "Only her words," Diep murmurs. "She seemed sincere, but I couldn't tell if it was real or just another lie." The faint sizzle from the grill fills the silence between them. James's gaze sharpens. "We can't rely on what she says. We need to verify everything." Diep looks up, uncertain. "How? Who can we trust with something like this?" "Mr. Lee," James replies firmly. "He's helped verify family histories before. He can look into her background." Diep exhales slowly, feeling both relieved and afraid. "If she truly is Nye's grandmother," she says, "then she deserves to see her. But if she's not, then we'll protect Nye," James finishes for her, "no matter what." Diep nods, though the words make her chest tighten. Nye isn't just a child she took in, she's family. Letting her go would feel like tearing out a piece of her heart. The moment lingers in silence, broken only by the soft clink of dishes. Later that night, Diep sits at the table again, a glass of orange juice untouched beside her. "We have to be careful," she says quietly. "We need to check everything about that woman. Her name, her family, her living situation." James nods. "We will, and maybe we should ask Nye how she feels too." Diep smiles faintly, though her eyes glisten. She's still too young to understand. What if she says yes because she feels she has to? "Then we'll help her see the truth," James replies, his voice gentle but steady. Diep nods again, her hand trembling slightly as she sets the glass down. "As long as Nye's happy," she whispers, "I'll accept it." But her tone betrays her pain. She tries to sound strong, yet inside she's terrified. Terrified of losing the little girl who brought color back into her world. James watches her quietly, then reaches across the table, his hand brushing hers. "Whatever happens," he says softly, "we'll face it together." She gives a small, grateful nod. It's all she can manage. The next morning, James wakes early and makes a few calls. By noon, Mr. Lee has agreed to meet them. When they arrive at his office, the air feels heavy with anticipation. The blinds filter golden light across the room, landing on stacks of papers and neatly lined folders. Mr. Lee greets them warmly. "It's been some time," he says, gesturing for them to sit. Diep gets straight to the point. "Someone came to us claiming to be Nye's grandmother," she explains. "We need to know if it's true." James adds, "We also want to make sure she's living in a safe and stable environment. Nye's well-being comes first." Mr. Lee nods, scribbling notes as he listens. "Do you have her name and contact information?" Diep slides a small slip of paper across the desk. "Here." He studies it briefly. "All right. Give me 1 or 2 days. I'll check public records, family connections, and background details." Diep exhales, relief mixing with anxiety. "Thank you. We really appreciate it." Mr. Lee smiles reassuringly. "Don't thank me yet. Let's see what the truth says." James then places an envelope on the desk. $10,000, he says. "Use it for the verification. Whatever resources you need." Mr. Lee raises an eyebrow, but accepts it without question. "Understood. I'll make sure this moves quickly." Diep glances at James, startled. "That's a lot of money." He meets her eyes. "We can't risk delays. The sooner we know, the better for Nye." Mr. Lee nods approvingly. "You're good people," he says, "and you're doing the right thing." As they leave, Diep's mind spins. The relief of taking action battles the fear of what might come next. That night, the farmhouse feels too quiet. Diep lies awake, staring at the ceiling as rain taps softly against the window. James turns beside her, noticing her stillness. "You're thinking about Nye again," he says quietly. Diep nods. What if that woman's telling the truth? What if Nye really belongs to her? James pauses before answering. "Blood doesn't always mean family. You gave Nye love, safety, and a home. That's what matters." Diep's eyes glisten in the dark. "I just don't want her to be hurt." "She won't be," he says gently, "because you'll make sure of that." For a while, they just lie there in silence. The rain grows heavier, a rhythmic comfort against their fears. The next afternoon, they return to the farm. Rows of green stretch beneath a clear sky. The beauty should be calming, but Diep's heart is restless. "If Nye ever leaves," she whispers, "this place will feel empty." James stands beside her, his gaze steady, then lets fill it again, with something new. She turns to him, puzzled. "What do you mean?" "You understand farming better than anyone I know," he says. "You could start your own agricultural business, build something from the ground up." Diep laughs softly, shaking her head. "Me? Running a business? That's too much." "Not for you," James says with a small smile. "You've rebuilt everything after the storm. You can do this too. And if you fail, then we'll start again. Together." His confidence disarms her. "You'd really invest in me?" "Every cent," he says simply. For the first time in days, Diep's heart feels a flicker of warmth. She looks out across the fields, imagining crates of fruit bearing her name, her brand. The idea feels distant, but not impossible. Still, her thoughts circle back to Nye. That little laugh, that tiny voice calling her mom. They echo inside her chest. James senses it. "No matter what happens," he says softly, "you'll never lose her. Some bonds can't be broken." Diep nods slowly, her eyes glistening under the sunlight. "I hope you're right." The golden glow of sunset paints the fields around them, the sky awash in warm light. It feels like the calm before something big, the truth waiting just around the corner. As the wind rustles through the crops, Diep closes her eyes for a moment. She doesn't know what tomorrow will bring. But one thing is certain. Whatever truth Mr. Lee uncovers, she'll face it head on. Because Nye's happiness, above all else, will always come first. 2 days later, James's phone rings early in the morning. The caller ID flashes Mr. Lee. He answers immediately, and Diep, still half asleep beside him, sits up at the sound of his serious tone. "Yes, Mr. Lee?" James says, voice tense. "I have news," comes the reply. "It's complicated. You both should come in." Diep's heart skips a beat. "We'll be there in an hour," James replies, already reaching for his jacket. Mr. Lee's office feels colder than before. The sunlight that once filtered warmly through the blinds now seems sharp, almost accusing. A stack of documents lies open on the desk. "I found her," Mr. Lee begins, glancing between them. The woman claiming to be Nye's grandmother is named Tran Thi Hoa. Her background checks out. She's registered as the mother of Nye's biological mother. Diep's breath catches. "So she's real," she whispers. "Yes," Mr. Lee confirms. "But there's more. Her daughter, Nye's mother, passed away years ago in a factory accident. Since then, Mrs. Hoa has been struggling financially. Her records show multiple job changes, medical debts, and most concerningly, a recent eviction." James leans forward. "So she's not in a stable situation?" Mr. Lee nods. "Exactly. On paper, she's Nye's grandmother. But legally and ethically, it's unclear if she can care for a child. She has no fixed address now. She's been staying with relatives outside the city." Diep grips the edge of the chair, her knuckles white. "Does she know where we live?" Mr. Lee hesitates before answering. "Not yet, but she's been asking around. She wants to meet Nye." Silence fills the room. The hum of the air conditioner sounds deafening. After a long pause, Diep whispers, "If she's telling the truth, I can't deny her the right to see her granddaughter." James looks at her, concern shadowing his face. "Diep, think about Nye. Meeting her could confuse the child, especially if that woman can't provide a stable home." "I know," Diep says, her voice breaking. "But how can I say no to someone who's lost everything?" Mr. Lee clears his throat softly. "There's a legal route," he says. "You can apply for a guardianship verification. The court would decide who's best suited to raise Nye based on stability, income, and emotional connection." James nods. "Let's do it. Whatever it takes to make sure Nye's safe." Diep glances at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and fear. "You're really willing to go that far?" "Of course," he says quietly, "because Nye deserves clarity. And so do you." That afternoon, they return home. The air feels heavy, as if the whole house knows what's coming. Diep sits at the table, reading through the documents Mr. Lee sent over. The words blur before her eyes. Guardianship hearing, proof of stability, emotional welfare. James stands by the window, his phone pressed to his ear, arranging meetings with a lawyer. When he hangs up, he turns to her. "The lawyer can file everything this week. But Diep," he pauses, "there's something else you should know. The hearing could bring Mrs. Hoa here." face to face. Diep's throat tightens. She looks down at her hands. "Then I'll be ready," she says softly. Her courage surprises even her, but deep down, she knows if she's going to fight for Nye, she must do it with truth, not fear. 3 days later, they arrive at the courthouse. The morning air is sharp, and the smell of rain lingers from the night before. Diep clutches a small photo of Nye, her smile bright and pure, as if it's a talisman. Inside, Mrs. Hoa waits by the hallway, her frame frail, but her eyes alert. She turns as Diep approaches. For a moment, neither woman speaks. Then, in a voice soft but trembling, Mrs. Hoa says, "You're the one raising my granddaughter." Diep nods slowly. "Yes, and I love her deeply." Mrs. Hoa studies her, tears glistening in her weathered eyes. "I can tell. She looks healthy, happy. Thank you for that." Diep feels a lump rise in her throat. "She's everything to us," she says. "But if you truly are her grandmother, I'll never stop you from seeing her." Mrs. Hoa nods faintly. "I don't want to take her away," she says. "I just want to see her before I'm too old to." The simplicity of those words cuts deep. Diep swallows hard, unsure if she's hearing truth or strategy. Before she can respond, a court clerk opens the door. It's time. Inside the hearing room, the atmosphere is somber. The judge, an older woman with silver hair and kind but firm eyes, listens intently as Mr. Lee presents his findings. "According to our research," he explains, "Mrs. Hoa is indeed the biological grandmother. However, due to unstable living conditions, she may not be suitable as a primary guardian." The judge nods. "And the child's current caretakers?" James rises, his tone steady. "My wife and I have raised Nye since she was abandoned. We've provided her with a home, education, and emotional care. We only want what's best for her." Mrs. Hoa lowers her head, wringing her hands. "I don't doubt that," she says softly. "But I've lost everyone in my family. She's all I have left." The room goes silent. Even the judge takes a moment before speaking again. "It's clear that both sides care deeply for this child," she says gently. "But the court's decision must prioritize stability and the child's welfare above all." As the proceedings continue, Diep listens in silence, her heart pounding. Every word feels like a stone added to the weight in her chest. When it's her turn to speak, her voice trembles. "I don't want to take Nye away from her grandmother," she says. "But I can't let her live in uncertainty. I'll make sure they meet. But Nye needs a safe, steady home. That's all I want." For a moment, the judge just looks at her, perhaps sensing the sincerity in every word. When the hearing ends, the decision is postponed, pending further review. Outside the courthouse, the rain begins again, light but persistent. Mrs. Hoa approaches Diep, her expression tired yet gentle. "I know you love her," she says quietly. "Maybe you're the mother she was meant to have." Diep's eyes fill with tears. "You can visit any time," she says softly. "Nye deserves to know where she came from. But please, let her stay where she's safe." Mrs. Hoa nods slowly. "Thank you. That's all I wanted. To know she's loved." James watches as the older woman walks away into the rain, her figure fading against the gray street. He turns to Diep, and touches her shoulder gently. You did the right thing. Diep exhales shakily. I hope so. She looks up at the sky, where clouds part slightly to reveal a sliver of sunlight. It feels fragile, but real, like hope after a long storm. Days later, back at the farm, Diep receives an envelope in the mail. Inside is a letter from Mrs. Hoa. Thank you for raising Nai. I'll always be grateful. Please tell her I love her. Diep folds the paper carefully, her heart heavy yet peaceful. She looks out the window, where Ni is chasing butterflies near the garden, her laughter filling the air.